Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we're pulling back the curtain on stories that the polluters and the policymakers hope you never connect. From the hidden emissions choking Europe's port cities to the global fight over who bears the cost of climate inaction.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Tonight's investigation starts on the waterfront, where we've uncovered data showing that the ferry industry, an industry most people barely think about, is pumping out more pollution than millions of cars combined. We'll also examine why a generation of young people in one of the world's richest nations is refusing to have children, citing climate anxiety as a core reason.
Then we turn to Washington, where the federal government has effectively slammed the brakes on climate regulation, and ask the hard question, can cities and states pick up the slack, or is that just a comforting myth? We've got a Nature editorial that lays it all out.
Plus, we dig into who actually bears the risk when climate research goes global but the funding stays concentrated in a handful of wealthy nations. And we look at new research on sustainable construction that challenges the entire way we build our world. It's a packed show tonight.
So let's get into it. Our top story, ferries. You probably think of them as a quaint, even green alternative to flying. Turns out, that assumption is dangerously wrong.
Alex, this one comes from a devastating new report covered by CleanTechnica, and the numbers are staggering. Ferries operating in European waters are now emitting more carbon dioxide than 6.6 million passenger cars. Let that sink in. We're not talking about massive container ships or oil tankers. We're talking about the vessels that shuttle tourists and commuters between ports every single day.
And it gets worse when you zoom in on individual cities. According to the report, ferries are responsible for more local air pollution than all the cars in cities like Barcelona, Dublin, and Naples. Dublin, in fact, was ranked the most polluted ferry port in Europe for 2025. The Irish capital, a city that's been aggressively promoting cycling and public transit, is being choked by emissions from its own harbor.
What's so insidious about this is the invisibility of it. Cities spend billions on electric vehicle incentives, congestion charges, and low-emission zones for cars. Meanwhile, these massive vessels are burning some of the dirtiest fuel on the planet just offshore, and nobody's regulating them with anywhere near the same urgency. The ferry industry has essentially been operating in a regulatory blind spot.
And let's talk about what's in that exhaust. We're not just talking about CO2 here. Ferries burn heavy fuel oil and marine diesel, which produces sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter, the kind of fine particles that penetrate deep into your lungs and are linked to heart disease, stroke, and premature death. Residents living near these ports are breathing this in every single day.
The health implications are enormous. Studies have consistently shown that communities near ports have higher rates of respiratory illness and cardiovascular disease. And these aren't wealthy waterfront communities with the political clout to fight back. In many European cities, port-adjacent neighborhoods are working-class areas with immigrant populations, people who have the least political power to demand change.
So who benefits from this arrangement? Follow the money. The ferry industry in Europe is a multi-billion-euro business. Companies like Stena Line, Viking Line, Irish Ferries, and others operate massive fleets. They've been slow to adopt cleaner technologies because heavy fuel oil is cheap, and the regulatory framework lets them get away with it. The International Maritime Organization has been notoriously slow to impose meaningful emission standards on passenger vessels.
And here's the kicker, the technology to fix this exists right now. Battery electric ferries are already operating in Scandinavia. Norway has been leading the charge, with fully electric ferries crossing fjords on battery power. Hybrid solutions are available. LNG is a transitional option. But widespread adoption requires investment, and more importantly, it requires regulation that forces the industry's hand. Without mandates, the economics favor dirty fuel every single time.
The European Union has started making noise about including shipping in its emissions trading system, but enforcement is patchy and timelines are slow. Meanwhile, every day these ferries operate, they're undermining the climate gains that cities are fighting so hard to achieve on land. You can ban every diesel car in Barcelona, and the ferries in the port will still be pumping out more pollution than all of them combined.
It's a perfect example of how climate policy fails when it operates in silos. Transport policy focuses on roads. Energy policy focuses on power plants. Maritime policy is handled by a completely different set of regulators at the international level. And in those gaps, entire industries continue to pollute with impunity. The ferry report should be a wake-up call, not just for Europe, but for every coastal city in the world.
Now let's shift to a story that might seem unrelated on the surface, but stick with us, the connections run deep. We're going to Singapore, one of the wealthiest and most developed nations on Earth, where the government is facing what officials themselves are calling an existential fertility crisis. And climate change is right at the center of it.
The South China Morning Post has published a striking investigation into why young Singaporeans are increasingly choosing not to have children. And while economic pressures and career ambitions play a role, what's remarkable is how prominently climate anxiety features in their reasoning. We're hearing from people like 34-year-old market researcher Joey Lau, who told reporters that even if she were a millionaire with unlimited free time, she still wouldn't want children.
Think about what that means. This isn't a story about people who can't afford kids. Singapore's government has thrown everything at this problem: baby bonuses, subsidized childcare, tax breaks for parents. The total fertility rate has plummeted to historic lows. And the people saying no aren't citing money. They're citing the future. They're looking at climate projections, at rising seas threatening their island nation, at extreme heat events, and saying, I cannot in good conscience bring a child into this world.
Singapore is uniquely vulnerable to climate change. It's a low-lying island city-state. Sea level rise isn't an abstract threat there, it's an engineering emergency. The government has committed 100 billion Singapore dollars to coastal protection over the coming century. Young Singaporeans see this. They read the IPCC reports. They watch the news. And they're making deeply personal reproductive decisions based on climate science.
This phenomenon has a name in demographic research. It's called climate-related reproductive anxiety, and it's not limited to Singapore. Studies have documented it across Europe, North America, and East Asia. But Singapore is the canary in the coal mine because its fertility rate was already critically low. When you layer climate anxiety on top of existing pressures from social media, housing costs, and work culture, you get a demographic spiral that threatens the economic model of the entire nation.
And here's where the investigative lens matters. Who is responsible for this anxiety? It's not irrational. These young people are responding rationally to real data. The IPCC has warned that without dramatic emissions cuts, we face catastrophic warming. The fossil fuel industry spent decades suppressing that science. Governments delayed action for generations. And now a generation of young people is so terrified of the future that they're choosing not to reproduce. The polluters created this crisis, and the demographic consequences are landing on societies that did comparatively little to cause the emissions in the first place.
Singapore's per capita emissions are moderate by developed nation standards, and the country has been relatively aggressive on green building codes, public transit, and urban planning. Yet its citizens are bearing the psychological burden of a global failure to act on climate. That's not just a policy problem, it's a moral indictment of every government and corporation that delayed climate action for profit.
The Singapore government is reportedly exploring new pronatalist policies, but demographers warn that no amount of financial incentives can overcome existential dread. You can't bribe people into optimism about the future. The only policy that would actually address climate-driven fertility decline is aggressive, genuine climate action, the kind that gives young people a reason to believe the future is worth investing in.
And that brings us to our next story, which lands right at the heart of that question. Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, has published an editorial with a stark message: U.S. climate actions must continue, despite setbacks. The setbacks they're referring to are not subtle. The United States has, in their words, slammed the brakes on legal routes to limit greenhouse gases.
Let's be specific about what's happened. The current administration has rolled back environmental regulations across the board. The EPA's authority to regulate power plant emissions has been curtailed. Federal leasing for oil and gas drilling has been expanded. The U.S. has pulled back from international climate commitments. And key enforcement mechanisms for existing environmental laws have been defunded or deprioritized. This isn't a slowdown, it's a reversal.
Nature's editorial argues that the burden now falls on cities, states, and the private sector to maintain climate momentum. And to their credit, many are stepping up. California continues to enforce its own emissions standards. New York has committed to ambitious building electrification timelines. Corporate renewable energy procurement is still growing. But here's the uncomfortable truth that the editorial dances around: subnational action, while valuable, cannot substitute for federal policy.
That's the critical point. Climate change is a problem of scale. You need national-level carbon pricing. You need federal investment in grid infrastructure. You need international agreements that only sovereign nations can negotiate. When cities and states act alone, they face competitive disadvantages, legal challenges from the federal government, and limitations on their regulatory authority. The patchwork approach is better than nothing, but it is not a climate strategy.
And there's a deeper structural issue here. The rollback of federal climate policy isn't happening in a vacuum. It's the result of decades of lobbying by fossil fuel interests, strategic litigation by industry groups, and a Supreme Court that has systematically narrowed the EPA's regulatory authority. The Chevron deference doctrine, which for 40 years allowed agencies to interpret ambiguous environmental statutes, has been effectively gutted. The legal architecture for federal climate action is being dismantled brick by brick.
Nature calls on researchers, businesses, and local governments to fill the gap. But let's be honest about the power dynamics. ExxonMobil's annual revenue exceeds the GDP of most U.S. states. The fossil fuel industry spent over $120 million on federal lobbying in the last election cycle alone. Asking cities and nonprofits to outspend and outorganize that machinery is not a strategy, it's a prayer.
What the editorial gets right is the urgency. Every year of delayed federal action locks in more emissions, more infrastructure built around fossil fuels, and more warming. The International Energy Agency has warned that the window for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is essentially closed, and even 2 degrees requires immediate, dramatic action. The U.S., historically the largest cumulative emitter, stepping back from that effort is not just a domestic policy failure. It's a global catastrophe.
And it directly connects to our next story, which addresses exactly this question of global responsibility. Nature has published a second piece, a commentary arguing that climate research is global, but the risks and responsibilities of that research are distributed profoundly unequally. This goes beyond who funds the science. It's about who bears the consequences when that science is ignored.
Here's the pattern that this commentary exposes. The vast majority of climate research funding comes from a handful of wealthy nations, the US, UK, Germany, Japan, and a few others. That research is conducted largely at institutions in those countries, published in journals based in those countries, and shaped by the priorities and frameworks of those countries. But the impacts of climate change fall disproportionately on the global south, on nations that contributed least to the emissions driving the crisis.
This creates a deeply problematic dynamic. Researchers in wealthy nations study climate impacts in vulnerable regions, publish papers that advance their careers, and then return home to countries with the resources to adapt. Meanwhile, the communities they studied continue to face floods, droughts, and heat waves without adequate support. It's a form of extractive research, taking knowledge from vulnerable communities without ensuring that knowledge translates into protection for those communities.
The commentary calls for a fundamental restructuring of how climate research is funded, conducted, and applied. It argues for greater investment in research capacity in vulnerable nations, for equitable partnerships rather than extractive ones, and for ensuring that the communities most affected by climate change have a genuine voice in setting research priorities. These are not radical demands, they're basic principles of ethical research.
But implementing them requires confronting uncomfortable truths about power in the global scientific community. Funding bodies in wealthy nations set the agenda. Journal editors in London and New York decide what gets published. Citation metrics reward researchers at well-resourced institutions. The entire infrastructure of climate science is built on inequalities that mirror the inequalities of the climate crisis itself. You cannot solve an unjust problem with unjust tools.
And there's a practical dimension too. Local researchers in vulnerable regions have knowledge that outside scientists simply cannot replicate, understanding of local ecosystems, community dynamics, indigenous practices for managing environmental variability. When climate research is dominated by outside institutions, that knowledge gets sidelined. The result is climate adaptation strategies that look great in academic papers but fail in practice because they weren't designed with or by the people who need them most.
This connects directly to the US policy story. When the world's largest research funder pulls back from climate science, the impact isn't felt equally. Wealthy European institutions can absorb the shock. But collaborative programs with researchers in developing nations, programs that were already underfunded, are the first to be cut. The retreat from climate action in Washington ripples outward, and the waves hit the most vulnerable shores hardest.
Now let's turn to our final story, which brings this all together in a surprising way. A new paper on the AR-14 preprint server tackles the challenge of sustainable construction, and it argues that the way we build our physical world is one of the largest and most overlooked drivers of climate change. The built environment, according to this research, contributes significantly to global greenhouse gas emissions, resource depletion, and environmental degradation.
This is a field that doesn't get nearly enough attention. When we talk about climate solutions, the conversation gravitates toward energy and transport. But buildings account for roughly 40% of global energy consumption and about a third of greenhouse gas emissions when you include construction, materials, and operation. The concrete industry alone produces more CO2 than most countries. Steel production for construction is another massive source. And yet, building codes in most nations still prioritize cost over sustainability.
What makes this paper significant is its emphasis on cross-disciplinary integration. The authors argue that sustainable construction cannot be achieved by any single field working in isolation. You need material scientists developing low-carbon concrete and timber alternatives. You need architects designing for passive heating and cooling. You need engineers optimizing structural systems to use less material. You need environmental scientists assessing life cycle impacts. And critically, you need social scientists understanding how people actually use buildings, because the most energy-efficient building in the world is worthless if its occupants override the systems because they're uncomfortable.
The paper highlights a fundamental disconnect in how we educate and organize professionals in the built environment. Architecture schools teach design. Engineering schools teach structure. Environmental science programs teach ecology. But sustainable construction requires all of these disciplines to work together from the earliest stages of a project. Instead, what typically happens is that sustainability gets bolted on at the end, an afterthought rather than a foundation.
And here's where the money trail matters again. The construction industry is one of the most conservative sectors in the global economy. It's dominated by established practices, resistant to innovation, and driven by short-term cost calculations. Developers build to minimum code requirements because that's what maximizes profit. Governments set those minimum requirements based on lobbying from the industry. And the result is a built environment that locks in decades of energy waste and emissions with every new building that goes up.
The solutions exist. Mass timber construction can sequester carbon rather than emit it. Geopolymer cements can slash the carbon footprint of concrete. Passive house standards can reduce building energy consumption by 90%. Modular construction can minimize waste. But adoption is painfully slow because the regulatory and financial systems reward business as usual. Banks are more comfortable financing conventional construction. Insurance companies don't yet price climate risk into building standards. And building codes take years to update.
This connects to every other story we've covered tonight. We have the technology to clean up ferries, but the industry resists. We have the knowledge to address climate change, but the US government is retreating. We have the research capacity to develop solutions, but it's concentrated in wealthy nations. And we have the building science to construct sustainably, but the market incentives point the wrong way. The pattern is the same in every case, the solutions exist, but the systems of power that profit from the status quo are blocking their adoption.
Now let's pull all of these threads together, because this is where Truth Report earns its name. Tonight we've covered 5 stories that, on the surface, seem disconnected: ferry pollution in European ports, fertility decline in Singapore, US climate policy rollbacks, inequity in global climate research, and sustainable construction science. But they are all chapters in the same story.
That story is this: the global systems we've built, economic, political, scientific, industrial, are structurally incapable of responding to the climate crisis at the speed and scale required. Not because the solutions don't exist, but because the people and institutions who profit from the current system have captured the mechanisms of change. The ferry industry lobbies against emissions standards. The fossil fuel industry lobbies against climate regulation. The construction industry lobbies against stronger building codes. And the global research system reflects the priorities of funders, not the needs of the most vulnerable.
And the human cost of this systemic failure is showing up in the most intimate decisions people make. When a 34-year-old woman in Singapore decides not to have children because she's terrified of the future, that is not a personal lifestyle choice. That is the downstream consequence of 50 years of deliberate climate obstruction by the fossil fuel industry and the governments that enabled them. Demographic collapse in wealthy Asian nations is, in part, a fossil fuel externality, and it should be named as such.
The Nature editorials we covered tonight frame this as a question of continuing action despite setbacks. And that's true as far as it goes. But it doesn't go far enough. The setbacks aren't acts of nature, they're acts of policy, driven by identifiable interests. When federal climate regulation is dismantled, we can name the lobbying groups that funded it. When research partnerships with vulnerable nations get cut, we can trace the budget decisions. When ferry emissions go unregulated, we can identify the industry associations that fought the standards.
Accountability is the missing element in so much climate reporting. It's not enough to say that emissions are rising or that policy is insufficient. We need to name the actors, trace the money, and hold specific decision-makers responsible. The ferry companies burning dirty fuel in European ports have names and boards of directors. The legislators blocking climate regulation have donors and voting records. The construction firms building to minimum standards have shareholders and quarterly earnings.
The sustainable construction paper we covered actually offers a useful framework here. It argues for cross-disciplinary integration, breaking down the silos between fields to address a systemic problem. That principle applies far beyond construction. The climate crisis itself demands cross-disciplinary, cross-sector, cross-border integration. Environmental policy, trade policy, health policy, demographic policy, research funding, industrial regulation, they're all connected, and they all need to be pulling in the same direction.
And that brings us to what you, our audience, can actually do with this information. First, pay attention to the regulatory blind spots. Ferry emissions, building codes, maritime policy, these are areas where public pressure is almost non-existent, which is exactly why industry gets away with so much. Second, hold your local representatives accountable for the gap between their climate rhetoric and their actual votes on zoning, building standards, and port regulations.
Third, support organizations pushing for climate research equity, groups working to build scientific capacity in the global south and ensure that vulnerable communities have a voice in the research that affects them. Fourth, when you hear politicians say that cities and states can handle climate action without the federal government, push back. Demand federal policy. Subnational action is necessary but not sufficient, and letting the federal government off the hook is a gift to the fossil fuel lobby.
And finally, talk about the connections. The reason these stories stay siloed, ferries here, fertility there, construction somewhere else, is because disconnected stories are easier to ignore. When you see the pattern that the same structural forces are driving ferry pollution, climate policy rollbacks, research inequity, and demographic anxiety, the problem becomes undeniable. And undeniable problems eventually demand action.
That's our show for tonight. I'm Alex Truth. The facts don't care about lobbying budgets, and neither do we. We'll keep following the money, naming the names, and connecting the dots that others leave scattered.
And I'm Maya Clarity. If tonight's investigation made you think differently about even one of these issues, share it. Talk about it. The fossil fuel industry spent billions making sure these connections stay hidden. The least we can do is bring them into the light. For Truth Report, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Stay informed. Stay angry. And most importantly, stay engaged.